federal court judges continue to act out. Most recently, a federal court judge, Indira Talwani, imposed a injunction for 14 days directing the Department of Health Human Services to take all necessary steps to ensure that Medicaid funding continues to be dispersed. Now, that's in spite of the fact that the big, beautiful bill proposed by the President of the United States and his sponsors in Congress, that was passed by Congress and signed by the President and enacted into law, revoked Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. So this judge thinks that she knows better than 400 and some odd members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and the President of the United States. Leslie Corbly, you're not feeling it, are you?
Sure. So no surprise, I guess it's fairly easy to get an injunction, maybe in certain venues for almost anything you want these days. But I don't think that this will stand, and I don't believe it's unconstitutional for Congress to cut Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood.
Well, I mean, I think they invented the concept of Medicaid. They enacted it into law. It seems that they should be able to prescribe limits to Medicaid, but this judge thinks evidently that she knows better than Congress and the president. I'm just frankly astounded by the activism that judges are invoking and bringing their own bias into their cases. And you should know because you're a lawyer.
Yeah, that's kind of why these kind of things don't surprise me in some ways. Planned Parenthood is an enormous organization, and they have relied heavily on federal dollars for a long time. So I'm not at all surprised that they, want to do a last-ditch effort in order to preserve their funding, and that they, mounted a legal effort to that end. That's really no surprise to me. Now, whether this stands or not, I don't think it. Again, I think it's completely constitutional for Congress to cut Medicaid funding to Planned Parenthood. I think we're obligated on this.
It's going to stand for 14 days because I don't know where you would get emergency relief in less than 2 weeks. Do you think?
I don't. I mean, I certainly personally don't see the grounds here, either personally or professionally. But obviously, again, I'm not shocked that Planned Parenthood mounted a legal battle here in order to try to preserve access to federal funding, just because of how important it is for their operations.
So what does the Department of Health and Human Services do in the meantime?
I suppose in the meantime, they have to follow the court order. Although I wonder, I mean, I believe it was just a 2-week injunction, correct?
Yeah, 14 days.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because 2 weeks isn't very long, so I don't know what their cycle is for payments at the agency, or how it is that they engage in their billing. So I know the Trump administration has already appealed this issue. They're already, kind of pushing back on this. So I guess that remains to be seen. I just can't imagine where the justification for emergency relief ongoing would come from. 2 weeks is just not very long as far as keeping pay cycles moving along.
Well, and the Supreme Court recently ruled that these district court judges cannot usurp the power of the presidency, and that they cannot issue nationwide injunctions. They just flat out lack the authority and power to do that. But It's not stopping this judgy.
But that's interesting though, because when it comes to nationwide injunctions, that was only related to the parties involved. So since Planned Parenthood is the only party involved and they're a nationwide organization, that's to some degree a little bit of a workaround for that. But as far as the underlying merits of Congress being essentially required to fund Planned Parenthood, I think that's a really weak argument. That there's some requirement that federal funding has to flow to specific organizations.
So I'm thinking that the administration just says, to heck with you. You can issue all the orders you want. We have a duly enacted law, and we're going to follow the law. If you don't like it, you can appeal to the Supreme Court or to the Court of Appeals. I mean, that sets up a constitutional crisis, but the courts are begging for it. To me, it seems they are literally begging for a fight. And when I was in law school, we learned a principle called judicial restraint.
Yeah.
They would not typically issue orders that they had no means of enforcing. Yet that does not seem to stop the liberal judges in today's environment.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate. Again, I really don't think anything should surprise Americans anymore in this realm. Yeah, organizations like Planned Parenthood require federal funds in order to operate. It should come as no surprise that they're rather unpleased that those funds have been stopped. And so, yeah, I think this is where we are now.
So, you, in addition to being an attorney, you're also an author. You've
Yes.
written Progressive Justice, or I'm sorry, Progressive Prejudice, exposing the devouring mother.
Hmm.
I'm not sure I understand what a devouring mother is. Can you um, expose that person to me?
For sure. So the devouring mothers, think of it as the archetype of pathological or toxic femininity. So we have a lot of those imagery and a lot of ideas of what it looks like to be a bad man, right? But we don't really often talk about what that archetype looks like on the female side. So the devouring mother would be essentially the concept of a mother who, rather than nurturing, uses her authority over children that usually should be put towards nurturing as a way to control and manipulate and serve herself through that, right? So it would be the perversion of caretaking that looks more like control than love.
Well, when does parenting transcend um, discipline and parenting and being a controlling, devouring mother?
Sure. So I mean, I guess it can look a lot of different ways, but the clinically the most common, I guess, manifestation of this would be what's called Munchausen by proxy, which is where the mother invents fictitious disorders of the child, so that then she can kind of keep the child in a perpetually infantilized role. So the child never gains the appropriate independence that comes from maternal love and nurture. And so it's interesting, actually. Now, like I think this is analogous to some degree to the Democratic Party's problems, because I think they embody some of those issues of toxic femininity, right? You think about how the Democratic Party often speaks a lot about their concern for those who are uh, on the margins, those who are disadvantaged or marginalized, and yet often their solution to that is to keep those on marginalized away from independence, right? So the idea of those who are marginalized end up being kind of perpetually connected to the government in order to sustain their lives. That's kind of an imagery, I think, for the concept of using love and nurture as a form of control rather than helping the person become independent and capable of leading a stable, successful life on their own. Right. So the
So,
devouring mother would be someone who tries to kind of keep her children from ever really leaving the nest.
are you a mother?
I am. I do. I have one son.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, what was the inspiration for you to write this book?
Sure. So I guess a couple of inspirations. So it's a blend of autobiography and cultural commentary. So I actually had come from a very toxic, abusive relationship with my own mother and noticed a lot of inconsistencies in our cultural rhetoric while I was growing up. And so one of the first words I remember learning was a word that my mom coined. It was called half aborted, and that's what she would refer to me as. And she was very pro life, so she wasn't pro choice by any means, but it did make me think a lot about some of these existential topics, particularly the abortion debate very early on in life. And it really exposed, in my view, a lot of the issues, both ethically and philosophically, with the pro-choice position, because I think it's so inherently anti-child in a way that we don't understand. Not just anti-child in utero, but I think it really puts women in an authority position over children that essentially creates a power dynamic that's really broken. Right? This idea that the one person who brought you into this world, who's supposed to love and care for you, has the um, unquestionable right to kill you, I think is a very existential thing for
Mm.
children to hear culturally. And I don't think most people really pause to think about that, because the whole issue is so wrapped up in women's liberation, and it's really framed as a women's issue. And I think it's actually a domestic violence issue, which I think will be increasingly easy to see as more abortions become at home abortions. So there'll be the likelihood that a child could see their sibling be killed, or witness that in some way that would have been more difficult prior to abortion pills becoming the more common way to end a pregnancy. So, at any rate, again, the idea being that there's just a lot of, we don't really, I don't think, have a very child centered discourse in our culture right now. And I think that's especially true in relation to mothers, because we both revere motherhood, but we also hate it.
Mm. So, in parenting your own son, Where how do you handle these issues? Where do you draw the line between loving and nurturing and disciplining in the event that that little saint of yours should act out or break a rule or worse, put himself in danger?
I know right now he's 11 months old, so I say he doesn't do anything really wrong yet.
Well,
My
you've got a lot to look forward to.
I know
I,
one
as the
day.
father of three sons who all turned out very well.
Yes, I guess my hope is that I can strike a balance between providing him nurture and warmth, but also ensuring that he has sufficient, grounding, that he feels secure in who he is and secure that he has a safe place to land, but that also it's safe to travel out into the world and make mistakes and, learn and grow, right? I mean, you have to have, I guess, a balance there. And I think that's why it's important for there to be, mothers and fathers. What I do for work is I do fathers' rights for work. So I'm a family law attorney
Uh,
that focuses on fathers' rights. And I do think that again, that aspect of that fatherhood has been lacking in our culture because we've been so focused on the sort of building up the feminine or women in a way, but I think in a way that's unhealthy to some degree because fathers are really important. And right now, the rhetoric surrounding fathers is really that you should man up, but only when you're told to, right? I mean, men have no rights to determine whether their children live or die right now. If men who grieve abortions, frankly, have kind of nowhere culturally to turn, it's a very disenfranchised form of pain to have to carry. And like, essentially, they're told you can't bond with a child until I tell you to, and it's on my terms. And I just don't think that that kind of power dynamic is the correct way to go about culturally or socially, because again, the family is involves the mother, the father, and the children. And I don't think saying women just have this automatic sex-based right to determine who lives and dies is appropriate. Nor do I think that that embodies equality.
it does appear to be framed that way, doesn't it? When they talk about a woman's right to choose, and I struggle with that. I mean, my retort is, what about the woman's right to choose at the point of conception? There was a decision to be made there,
Yes.
and I think that when you make that decision, you've got to live with the consequences, good or bad. Sort of my paradigm. But what about the father? Do they have any right in the case of an unwanted pregnancy, at least by the female member of the union? And then what about the child, the unborn child's rights? I mean,
Hmm.
to me, it's not just the would be mother's right to choose. It seems
Hmm.
that others might have a voice in this too, even the, the entity in this equation that has no voice.
Well, it's fascinating because again, the left focuses so heavily on consent, and there's been a lot of consent-based narratives. But the reality is that, from an existential standpoint of whether you live or die, let's just say that's the question you're asking: Do I want to live or die? Um, the child actually has no consent in that. They had no consent in coming to be. And so I think this idea that you have, this right to extinguish someone else's life, which is what women are told they have. You created a life and you have the right to extinguish it. But there's no similar right to suicide, right? We don't think of suicide as something that someone has an inherent right to. And yet the children, like children born, particularly, I mean, there are plenty of children who, for any number of reasons, would perhaps come of age and say, I really don't want to be here. And I didn't consent to be here. I didn't consent to the terms of this. Why shouldn't I be able to die?
Mm.
And that's considered a mental illness, and I think it should be. To be fair, I'm not saying that we should run around and say people should kill themselves. My point is more that, to your point, that the consent element is really only spoken of in terms of the woman.
Yeah.
Everyone else's rights involved here, the fact that they're affected and they are deeply affected by these issues, it tends to be steamrolled by this idea that there's some sacred right of women to control human life, and I think that that's, frankly, a form of perverted femininity. And I do think it's a form of toxic femininity that goes right into that devouring mother. Because, again, the idea of the devouring mother is one of the reasons she's able, the justification psychologically would be that that women, kind of the phrase "mother knows best." It's just the concept of, if a mother decides to have a baby or not, she always knows best. So she always knows best what to do for the child, how to care for the child. So the idea that the mother saying you deserve to die means the child does deserve to die. And I think it's worth noting that there's a godlike authority involved in this, right? Decisions about life and death of that kind of existential nature were historically that's wrapped up in God. right? That God has the ability and the right to determine who lives and dies because he sees all ends. He's all knowing, he's all powerful, he's particularly all knowing in this scenario, right? To therefore then know what the right outcome is in any given scenario. And the reality is women simply aren't. And yet we give this sort of God-like authority to women culturally, and I don't see any corresponding responsibility or scrutiny applied to that, right? So the whole idea is a woman can choose life or death for their child, and that shouldn't be scrutinized. So I find that just, I think, very hypocritical and odd. I don't think women have some inherent right to terminate their children that they intentionally brought into the world. Frankly, I think if a man were engaging in this kind of behavior, women would call them barbaric and brutal, right? Like, how dare you choose to create and then destroy what you created? Like, I think that would be inherently easy to see. Like, there's this idea that feminists often put forth that if men could get pregnant, then abortion would be state funded. And maybe that's true. But I think that the reverse is also true. If men were using abortion the way women do now, I think women would call them barbaric. I think they would say that's horrifying. Why would you use violence in that way? Right? That's a very violent thing to do. And so I think there's just not a lot of scrutiny applied to it, to that issue in particular, and it's viewed too much through the lens of just one perspective. Again, understandably, like, I understand there's all kinds of scenarios where, from a human standpoint, you would understand why a woman would want to abort, but the reality is that there's other interests and other human relatable stories that we don't talk about because they're uncomfortable, and they don't always cast women in a positive light.
So, in your law practice, where you're defending fathers' rights, what kind of issues do you deal with, and where do fathers' rights come into the legal sphere that you deal with?
Oh, sure. So all kinds of issues come into play. I mean, it's not uncommon for women to gain sole custody of the children. It's not uncommon for men to end up with minimal parent time. And so there's, I think what we try to do here is to ensure that the father's perspective um, is put forth, right, and that their rights to have a strong relationship with their child, as strong of a relationship as possible, is present, right? It's often, I think, very easy for the father to be the forgotten one in cases of child custody. And there are obviously cases where that's understandable, right? I mean, some men don't step up, they don't do the right thing. That happens, but it also happens that some men are alienated from their children, and that through no fault of their own, they're kind of cast as the bad person. And it is very easy for the maternal relationship to be the relationship that children automatically view as more comforting, right? So I do think that there's more of a struggle for children to pull away or separate their perspective and identity from their mother than there is their father. And that's understandable because their mother was their first human relationship, right? Your first human relationship is your mother. And so I think it's a very sacred relationship. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's important for the father's role, which comes later, to be secure and protected. You need to ensure that fathers don't lose the relationship with their children, because that is also a sacred role. It's just that the motherly role, I think it's harder for children to inherently separate from their mothers, right? That's who they were initially connected to. So if you have a woman who wants to kind of retain a very, like, enmeshed and emotionally perhaps entrapped relationship with a child, how's the child to know? You know what I mean? Like, really, the child can't know that. That's a very difficult thing for a child to understand.
So, you've written this book. It is called The Progressive Prejudice, and it is about exposing the devouring mother. Is the book out yet?
The book comes out in October. So it comes out October 21st. And again, it's a blend of my own sort of a journey as a child, but that's very much paired with cultural commentary, specifically that critiques heavily the left, because I do think those on the left embody this more toxic femininity issue, right? I think that that's just more of their orientation towards the world. And I think you see a lot of it on the left, and it simply goes unexposed because it's a little more covert. It's not as overt as male oppression, which tends to look like, I mean, if you've gotten beaten in the face, for example, there's bruises. But one of the things that's really difficult about these more emotional dynamics that happen with, I think, perverted femininity is that there aren't. So take, for example, the one disorder I gave you, Munchausen by proxy. It's remarkably difficult to mount a case that proves Munchausen by proxy is going on. You have to,
Mm.
have evidence of an enormous number of lies that have been spun over the years. So Gypsy Rose Blanchard is a very famous, good example of what Munchausen by proxy looks like in reality. Now, when you take out the medicalized element, so the element that's physical, and you you can have that same structure operating between a mother and a child, but without the physical element, in which case you're not going to have any visual proof. And so it really would be essentially the burden is then on the child to understand there's a relational dynamic here that's really broken, that's causing me harm. And that's incredibly difficult. And so I think that, again, I just think that there needs to be an awareness of the fact that these kind of relational problems exist, because I think we tend to deny them as a society because of our gender wars tend to get in the way of understanding that women can do as much harm as men.
Well, thank you, Leslie Corbly, a lawyer, author, and mother. And the book is coming out in October. Where do we find it?
Sure, Amazon's the easiest way to find it. I also have a website, lesliecorbly.com. I have a link there. So you can hop over to the website or go to Amazon, and the book is available for purchase.
Well, thank you very much. Good luck with the book, and thank you for coming on The Truth today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure.